J'avais envie de, à mon échelle, avoir un impact sur les femmes, d'aider les femmes. J'avais envie de pouvoir faire avancer les choses.
Moi, là-bas, je suis une personne créative. Je me suis jamais dit, initialement, voilà, je vais faire une marque éco-responsable, et ça a coulé de source.
Ça donne un sens incroyable à ce qu'on fait. Et c'est vrai qu'en ce moment, on parle beaucoup des matières, et c'est un enjeu fondamental. Il faut recycler, bien évidemment, pour lutter contre ce gaspillage industriel textile. Mais on parle un peu moins des hommes, je trouve. Et nous, c'est vraiment cette balance sur ces deux sujets-là qui sont tout autant fondamentaux l'un que l'autre.
C'est con, on parle de vêtements. Donc si t'as envie d'une robe rouge, je sais pas, avec des volants drapés, etc., tu peux la chercher pendant 15 jours, le temps de la trouver. T'as pas besoin d'en acheter une que tu trouves directement, qui est neuve.
Aujourd'hui, je pense que toutes les marques qui vont se créer ont un devoir moral de faire de leur mieux, ou en tout cas avec un engagement.
La clé essentielle du féminisme, je pense, c'est la notion de sororité. Et ça, je l'ai beaucoup développé dans mon travail, avec les femmes avec lesquelles je travaille, mes clientes essentiellement. Et en tout cas, moi, c'est vraiment comme ça que je suis rentrée dans ce métier.
Quand j'ai eu des bébés, je me disais, mais c'est quand même dingue, on leur met du benzène sur la peau, quoi. Et donc, je me suis dit, tiens, si un jour je devais faire quelque chose, je ferais des vêtements où il n'y a pas de produits, dans lesquels il n'y a pas de produits chimiques pour les bébés. C'est vraiment quelque chose auquel il faut faire attention.
Bienvenue dans Nouveau Modèle. Je suis Chloé Cohen et dans ce podcast, je donne la parole à des femmes engagées. Elles racontent ici leurs histoires, leurs parcours. Elles partagent leurs convictions et leurs combats écologiques, féministes, pour un monde plus juste, plus responsable et plus durable. Cette semaine, je reçois Ayesha Barenblat. Alors cette discussion est en anglais, mais n'hésitez pas à vous abonner à la newsletter du podcast pour recevoir l'interview en français. Dans cet épisode, Ayesha nous parle de sa famille, qui travaillait dans l'industrie textile au Pakistan. Elle prend conscience très jeune des dérives de la fast fashion, et c'est pour cette raison qu'elle décide de créer l'association Remake. Ayesha nous parle des missions de son ONG, comme les campagnes de sensibilisation, lancées régulièrement sur les réseaux sociaux. Et elle nous prouve qu'en tant que consommatrice et consommateur, on peut changer les choses, même en restant chez nous. Ayesha a répondu à mes questions depuis San Francisco et elle nous donne de précieux conseils pour changer nos habitudes de consommation. Sinon, à la fin de cet épisode, je vous annoncerai une très bonne nouvelle et en attendant, je vous souhaite une très belle écoute. Hello, Ayesha. Thank you so much for taking the time for me. First, could you present yourself very quickly? Where did you grow up? What did you study? For us to know you a little bit better.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chloe, for having me on. I'm thrilled to be here and to talk to your audience. So my name is Ayesha and I am the founder of Remake. I grew up in Karachi in Pakistan, and, my family ran clothing factories there. And so early on, I really understood the power of garment jobs to lift young women out of poverty. The fashion supply chain is one of the few industries that employs mostly women, some 75 million women who are in their early 20s. And so I've also, with the rise of fast fashion, just seen how much damage cheap and disposable clothes can do, especially to Black and brown women. I was getting my master's in public policy at UC Berkeley in California. And that's when I became really interested in the disconnect between, fashion brands and retailers talking about corporate responsibility and how it was taught in schools, and then just the reality of how our clothes are made on the factory floor. There was this disconnect, and that really started my 15-year journey of wanting to really think about the people who make our clothes and get everyday people to not forget her.
Okay, so you became aware of the drifts in the garment industry very early in your age and in your life.
Yes. I mean, I think it has, with the luxury of being a Pakistani American, and having these two worlds and two cultures. For me, I can very much see myself in the narrative of garment workers, and having the privilege that I now have sitting here in the United States. I feel like I can use this access and connection for people to not forget that it's mostly young women in their early 20s who look like me, who make our clothes around the world.
Yeah. And why did you create Remake? What was the inspiration behind Remake?
Yeah, on April 24th, 2013, Rana Plaza fell down, and it was the worst industrial disaster of our time. Over 1,134 young lives were cut short when that building fell down with several factories. And at the time, I worked for the International Labour Organization in Geneva. And, as the death toll started to mount, a lot of the brands and retailers that were in Rana Plaza started to worry about legal precedent and not wanting to compensate the victims' families. And so I realized we just need change sooner, faster. I had spent over a decade making the business case to fashion brands and retailers, working with luxury brands and fast fashion. But when Rana Plaza fell down, it became very personal to me. I realized we need a people-centered movement, to say that we can't have any more deaths, we can't have any more human rights abuses, environmental degradation, just for what? For cheap clothes, And so in all my years of working on labor advocacy, I realized that there's a seat absent at the table. And that's all of us, as everyday citizens who really needed to understand that there are millennial women who make our clothes. She's the forgotten girl boss at the other end of the supply chain. And so that's really Remake's founding story. We do a lot of film shorts and bring you photos and stories of the people who make our clothes. We pass the mic back to her. And the hope with Remake is really to remake this connection between everyday citizens and the makers of our clothes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And what are the missions exactly of Remake?
Yeah, so our big, lofty mission is to turn fashion, the fashion industry, into a force for good. And we do this first with transparency. As I mentioned, we go, before COVID-19, we would go into factories and dye houses and landfills and get people to really see the human and environmental impact of fashion. We also have a vetting process where we give our seal of approval to brands that are doing better, that are thinking about traceability and worker planet well-being. So we give our seal of approval to over 200 fashion brands at this point. And outside of the transparency work, we do a lot of education. Through our Warrior Values community. We started as an American conversation, but now we have French ambassadors as well, British ambassadors, community in Australia. And it's really a lot of young people who participate in our campaigns, participate in our workshop materials to say, we want to embrace a sustainable fashion lifestyle. We want to use our wallet and our voices to make fashion a force for good. So what we do is a lot of transparency work and education work.
Yeah, that's very important, the education. And can we become French ambassadors for you?
Yes, you can. And we have some French ambassadors. So I would love to welcome you. So much of this is the solidarity for all of us who love fashion to do this in a collective. And what our ambassadors do is they host film screenings, they host panels and workshops. Once the pandemic is over, we do a lot of swap parties because we know that the best way to be sustainable is to keep clothes in generation longer. So, anyone listening in, or for you, Chloe, we would love to welcome you as a Remake ambassador.
Oh, that's great. I would be honored to be one of your ambassadors. I was wondering also, what changes have you seen during the time you've been involved with sustainable supply chain management and the fashion industry more generally?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest changes we've seen is really this race to the bottom. Over the last 10 years, I think it's really accelerated with, not just fast fashion, but ultra fast fashion. You think about Amazon making a big play into fashion, Boohoo producing clothes so quickly and so cheaply. And so one of the things we've seen, even with some of the traditional luxury brands, is a lot of brands now pushing for product to be cheaper, for product to be faster, for there to be more and more seasons. We have Paris Fashion Week, New York Fashion Week, and just so much high turnover of garment, which has meant, a huge contribution to the climate crisis. We put out, something like 100 billion units of clothes out in the world. Most of them end up incinerated or in landfills. And, the product coming to us cheaper and faster has meant that for a lot of workers, they're working longer and longer hours, and their wages are covering less and less of their expenses. So unlivable wages is really the price of the clothing reflects the exploitation of women around the world. To me, fast fashion has been, the biggest change and just the staggering impact on waste as well as on human beings, which is often hidden, from our public consciousness.
Yeah. And how do you see the future of fast fashion?
In COVID-19, we have certainly seen just all of these issues come to a head, with so much of the fast fashion industry canceling orders, not paying workers. I think the future of fast fashion is complicated. Within our community, we see, double-digit growth. We have 400 ambassadors right now, community of 150,000 people who are committed to buying less and better. But across the world, whether you're sitting in Paris or here in San Francisco or London, we're also seeing global rising inequity. And people having less and less money to spend on fashion. And so as you see stores opening up, you see the long lines around fast fashion. So I think the fight to end this really comes with regulation, and we're needing better policy if we're wanting to put an end to fast fashion, because customers, as long as there is a market, will, I think, continue to buy, because a lot of them are up against limited income themselves.
Yes, of course. And I've read an interview where you talked about your most memorable conversations that you've had with a garment worker when you were filming in Cambodia. And can you tell us more about that experience?
Yeah, so much of the work that we do is about how do we pass the mic back to the people that make our clothes. I wish actually that Sri Yang could be on your podcast right now, if you could figure out the language and translation. And so, when we were in Cambodia filming our Made in Cambodia documentary, we were just struck by how, she had essentially told us that she was sacrificing her life and her well-being in order to assure that her daughter stays in school. And, that conversation really stayed with me, because I think what people don't realize is when we buy cheap clothes, when we support the cheap in fast fashion industry, that it's essentially keeping not just a generation, but multi-generations of women in poverty. And, her daughter wanted to leave school and join the fashion industry on the factory floor, much as her mother had at the age of 15, because she could see how little the family was bringing in. They invited us to the home, and looking at the home, you could see how much a garment worker's salary could afford. But the beauty, and one of the reasons that conversation stayed with me, was that at the end she told us that we're now sisters in our solidarity and fight for fair fashion. And, I really go back to that conversation over and over again, because the fashion industry is one of the few industries that is predominantly women-led, whether you think about the models marketing us the fashion or the garment workers making our fashion. And so this sisterhood and solidarity is so important.
Oh, yes, I completely agree with you. And I'm so glad you talk about sisterhood. I think it's so important, and especially in the fashion industry. And can we see the documentary in Cambodia, or where can we see it?
Made in Cambodia. It's on our platform, remake.world, but I can also send you a link so you can add it to your podcast so viewers can take a look. At this point, we have been to 10 different production hubs, so you can definitely see Made in Cambodia. Most recently, we were filming Made in Mexico. I think it's just to give people a lens and an eye that there are human beings behind our fashion labels, and to get to know their lives,
Yeah, that's so important. I totally agree. Yeah. And you talked also about the public policy that's important to change things and to make the industry be better. But the citizens and the people, we can change things. And you launched the Pay Up campaign. And I would be, I think it's interesting if you can tell us more about this campaign, the Pay Up campaign.
Yes, for people listening in who, maybe you've been sheltering at home for a long time, you're missing the cafe life, in Paris or wherever you might be, just to know that, you are still powerful as a citizen. And if anything, the Pay Up campaign is an example of how we can make a difference even if we are sitting at home. So when COVID-19 spread, we know that it has impacted the world's poorest and most vulnerable people the most, right? And in the context of fashion, this has brought devastation to the women who make our clothes. And so as retail stores had closed in March and April, with a lot of online sales falling across the US and Europe, a lot of brands and retailers pushed the risk down to their suppliers. They evoked the force majeure clause in their contracts, canceling orders that were already produced. And what's important to know is that factories had already paid for the materials, had already paid for the labor cost. In Bangladesh, for example, overnight, $3 billion worth of orders were canceled. And for a country that has 4.1 million workers who are mostly women, this meant that a lot of workers were furloughed or laid off, without savings, without access to healthcare. And so we very quickly mobilized, to hold the brands accountable. And what's been remarkable is that the campaign went viral. At this point, we have over 150,000 signatures on the Pay Up petition. We've had actresses like Nat Kelly, models like Arizona Muse and Amber Valletta and Cameron Russell, our own community engaging with over 4.9 million people to get brands to pay up. And, it led H&M to be the first brand to commit, then Zara followed. And as of yesterday, we now have 17 brands who have committed for back orders, which means that, 600 million has been unlocked in Bangladesh. And, if we estimate conservatively, that means we as citizens have held brands accountable to unlock $7.5 billion of orders that were produced but canceled but have now been paid. And so that means that workers were allowed to receive back wages. And it's just been fascinating for us, to take this campaigning online and see how we can still make a difference.
Yes, of course. But I don't understand, because brands like H&M or Zara have the money to pay the workers, the factories. Why did they choose not to? Because they could know that people would do something about it. No, don't you think?
Yeah, I think that there was a sense that everyone with COVID-19 was going to be so worried about the pandemic and what's happening to their own lives and, with unemployment. And I think, the brand behavior is just an example of how the fashion industry is set up, right? For many years, just pushing all the risk down to workers, because many of the brands are also, reneging on their retail lease commitments and, furloughing retail workers who've been protesting. And, we've heard similar things from warehouse workers. So at the end of the day, it's always the workers that bear the brunt, and I think what a lot of these brands did was realize that they needed to shore up their own balance sheets because, first quarter earnings otherwise wouldn't look good. They were trying to assure that they had cash reserves on hand. So when we've been talking to brands, a lot of their conversation is around, supply chain savings. We needed to assure savings from our supply chain to keep the business profitable, or as we are entering bankruptcy. Even for some of the brands who have entered administration and are going out of business, a lot of them have paid their shareholders and their executives at the cost of workers. And so it just illustrates how, the fashion empire is built to work for a few people rather than most.
Yeah, and it shows us that we have to pay attention. Still in 2020, we have to pay attention as citizens and make brands accountable for what they do, actually.
Exactly. And it can be quite empowering. Our community has talked about just how much they enjoy the Remake community, the solidarity we've had on Instagram and through the petitioning. It makes you feel good to feel like you can make a difference.
Yeah, I agree. And you also launched the social media campaign and challenge called No New Clothes. Can you tell us more about it too?
Yeah, they say it takes 90 days to change a habit, and one of the things that for years brands have been teaching us is that we need to buy more and more and more, volumes and volumes of cheap clothes that fall apart, that we know don't make us happy, that we know degrades our climate and environment and exploits women. And, one of the things we've really seen through the crisis of coronavirus is fashion retailers and brands' true colors with the postponement of orders, as we have been talking about. And so when we launched Pay Up, we decided that this was also a time for us to be looking inward. And so our community, knowing that it takes 90 days to change a habit, has launched a campaign over the summer, June 1st to September 1st, to say, for 90 days, we're going to buy nothing. Think of it as a fashion diet where we are really reflecting on the brand's actions and needing to become more inclusive and resilient, the fact that we need more deep systematic change. And then for our community, it has meant, doing a lot of virtual repairing and mending workshops. We've been having conversations about holding brands accountable, thinking about how we can wear pieces in our closet over and over again as we show our outfits on Zoom and that kind of thing. I think with COVID, we've realized, how much is essential purchases and how many purchases are not necessarily essential. And so the No New Clothes is really a way for our community to have a level set, to rediscover what they already own, and to reset their relationship with fashion. So it's not just about constantly buying and exploiting people and our planet.
Yeah. And do you have other advice for us consumers to be more engaged and to do something?
Yes, I would say take part in the challenge. You don't have to wait for June 1st. It may have come or gone, but we welcome people to continue our challenge of 90 days of No New Clothes. You can start anytime and think of it as a fashion cleanse. So that's one piece of advice. I'd say be curious and don't be afraid to speak up. Challenge brands, ask them questions. With especially so many sales moving online and so much of the brand reputation online, people often think that your voice doesn't matter. Can I, as one person, make a difference? And, what we learned is the power of us as a collective is really important. And so tag your favorite brands and say, hey, have you paid for your orders? Are you thinking about the people that make your label? Because I want to support you. So I would say those would be two things to do immediately. The other is thinking about your fashion habits, taking a stock of what you own. This is a great time to be looking at, are there piles and piles in your closet that don't make you happy? Maybe if you don't wear something more than 30 times, that you shouldn't buy it, As stores start to open up, rather than buying from fast fashion, check out maybe consignment or vintage or rental options, Think about clothes sort of like a good friend that you can invest in, that you can take care in, because there's so much human effort that goes behind our fashion. And for tips and tricks, because, embracing a sustainable fashion lifestyle can be quite lonely. Follow us on Instagram. Our handle is Remake Our World, and we're always giving you different types of ways to be a part of this lifestyle.
Yeah, because sometimes it's very difficult to convince people to change their habits, to have a more sustainable living, and especially in fashion. I don't know if you have the same problem sometimes, and you have to convince people around you.
Oh, completely. And I sometimes think having conversations like this, where it's people I don't know, the conversation is easier than when you're trying to convince your own friends or community. And I think one piece of advice there is, no one likes to be preached at, and so it's almost better to walk the talk rather than just talking at people, or making people feel bad about their purchases. So, if you wear something that is sustainable, that is secondhand, and you look beautiful, and someone wants to know, well, wow, you look great. Like, where did you get that? That's a great conversation starter to say, well, actually, I'm doing this No New Clothes challenge, and it's really fun. And it gives me a community and experiences over cheap clothes, and you should be a part of that challenge. That is almost a better conversation than saying, don't do this, don't do that, because I think, fashion is supposed to be joyful, right? An individual expression of your creativity.
Yeah, totally. And so do you think social media can really push fashion to change today?
I mean, 100%. The silver bullet, as we were talking about at the end of the day, is that through some of this activism, in the long run, what we need is better regulation. But social media has really reshaped how citizens can interact with brands. And, as we were unpacking this example of the Pay Up campaign, it's been our ability to use social media to give voice to some of the most vulnerable people in the fashion ecosystem, and to assure that garment workers have a voice. And so tagging brands, calling them out online, demanding transparency, and, the power of influencers in this world has also been interesting with, some of the models and ambassador community has really helped our campaign gain traction to amplify our message. And so I do think consumers demanding accountability in this virtual world, we have to use Instagram to protest right now because we're still sheltering in place, that it's definitely a way to push the industry towards being more a force for good.
Yeah. And in an article, you say something really interesting. You said, this is a time for all of us to be thinking about how we use our voices and our wallets to hold the fashion industry accountable rather than letting the industry commoditize the Black Lives Matter movement to sell us more stuff. And I think this expression and what you say is really interesting. And I was wondering, how can we hold the fashion industry accountable? We talked about the social media campaigns and this kind of stuff, but how can we hold the fashion industry accountable?
Yeah, at Remake, whenever we think about sustainability, it's really in an intersectional way. We know that environmental and social justice has to go hand in hand. And one of the things with the fashion industry is that, historically it's been a very racist system, which is inherited from a violent colonial past. And, the representation of Black voices within brands, within boards, within management is really missing. And so it's been interesting, not starting here in the United States, but seeing the movement of Black Lives Matter take off with, protests and solidarity in France, in the UK, in Germany. And one of the ways to hold the fashion industry accountable is, when they're posting the little black squares on Instagram and saying we stand with Black Lives Matter, is to say, well, how? And don't just tell us, show us. So if you care about Black voices, how are you supporting Black Lives Matter? And this isn't just about charity, it's about good business practice. So, what is the representation of Black people within your board, within your management level? How are you uplifting Black designers or Black owned brands? When we think about luxury or high street, there is so much structural change that we're needing, even in terms of, better protections for retail and factory workers, which are often people of color, that we've seen are the most vulnerable when, this pandemic has happened. And so, brands are very quick to often take social movements to sell us more stuff. And this is the time for us to hold them accountable to say, from your hiring decisions, from your designing decisions, from your making decisions, if you think Black Lives Matter, then do that. Don't just post a cute quote on Instagram and be done.
Yeah, I agree. And I forgot to ask you a question about the Pay Up campaign. I don't know if you had the opportunity to talk with garment workers in Bangladesh, for example. How do they see the situation from there?
Yeah, so one of the things that we at Remake are very careful about is that, we are a conduit and are talking to workers all the time, as well as worker-led organizations. And, it's been interesting in Bangladesh, first of all, I think for people to know how fierce some of these women-led worker organizations are. They are out protesting on the streets. They're up against police brutality and being arrested as they're trying to get back wages. Some of them have reported to us how they're food and housing insecure. And I think for a lot of them, it's to say that this is the moment. If we can't fix fashion now, we're never going to be able to fix it. But what's also also been fascinating is, some of our worker-led organization partners have also held signs of Black Lives Matter and showing that solidarity. And so this solidarity between garment workers, retail workers, warehouse workers has been incredible for us as well. But I think the thing that we hear from workers over and over again is this is not the time to turn your back, on us, especially when so many brands talk about sustainability. And it's to say, where is your sustainability now? When you're canceling orders or you're delaying payments without thinking about the impact on workers' lives.
Yeah. And when I listen to you, I can realize that human rights and the people are really important for you. We realize that. Where does it come from, you think? Is it from your education, or why do you care a lot about those people?
Yeah, I think it's because I've had the privilege to spend a lot of time in worker communities and in production hubs, and so much of what I know of the, of workers and the sort of friendships I've made over the years is to see that, she is, she as in, most garment workers, she's supporting upwards of 4 or 5 family members on a salary. She's a fierce girl boss at the other end. She's so core to the fashion industry. And so I think for me, especially in this pandemic, it's become very personal, and perhaps that might be partly my heritage, but I think more than anything else, it's when you see it, you can feel it and feel that empathy and connection, and so that's really the hope with our Made In series and our documentary work is that I can make you feel the same kinds of emotions, to care very deeply about workers around the world.
And how do you see the future of sustainability in the fashion industry?
I think, first of all, we almost need to be talking about resilience instead of sustainability. In some ways, coronavirus has cracked wide open how fragile supply chains are. First we saw the material shortages in China, then we saw the global collapse in March when the pandemic started to spread. And then as the supply chain connections ruptured, we saw the domino effect on workers, and the pandemic has really just shown us how vulnerable the supply chain system is to shocks. And so, brands often like to market sustainability, which is a lot of greenwashing. And so I almost hope that brands think about sustainability more as building resilient supply chains, because we know, given how many people there are on this planet, that this won't be our last pandemic. There will be future pandemics, there will be future climate shocks, and only brands that have built deep and meaningful partnerships with their supplier partners, that are consolidating their supply chains, that are investing in worker communities, are the ones that are going to be resilient. So I think first and foremost, we need that reframe of what it means to be truly sustainable. I think secondly, we really need an overall of contract and financial terms. Most of the fashion industry today operates on debt. It's standard industry practice that it can take up to 120 days after the goods are shipped for the suppliers to be paid, and they have to front the material cost and the labor cost. And so, what we've seen is there's just no legal recourse when the brands have evoked the force majeure clause and essentially just canceled orders. And so I think we need to go back to irrevocable letters of credit. We need bank guarantees of buyer obligations. We need to have clarity in contracts and in financial terms that brands can't just cut and run. And I think, the rebuild that has to come, because, every moment of darkness there has to be light, right? Is that the fashion system really has to center around diversity and inclusion, that the industry must acknowledge its deeply racist system, and that we need better representation all the way from model to maker of people of color, and to make sure that the system is more just and sustainable for all. And so if we were to dream a little bit, what that means for everyday citizens also is that we have to buy less and better. If anything, this pandemic has taught us, we don't need this volume of non-essential products we keep buying and buying that end up in landfills. We're here to inspire. Can we get 1 million women to embrace a sustainable lifestyle by 2025, where we are advocating for the people that make our products, where we are picking experiences over cheap clothes. And my hope is that the future of fashion really is about buying less and better.
Yeah, I so agree with you. And this is a personal point of view, but sometimes I have the impression that the environment is more important than the human rights in the fashion industry. I mean, in the streets of Paris, we saw a few days ago the new campaign of H&M about the new sustainable clothes they make with sustainable cotton, organic cotton, and this kind of stuff. But people forget about human rights. I don't know if it's a strategy of brands or I can't explain that, but sometimes I have the impression that the environment is more important than the human rights.
Yeah.
I don't know if you agree with that, but
yeah. I mean, I agree with that, and I think at the end of the day, it comes down to money. Right? So as we've been working so hard, and particularly with Gen Z and millennials, we're seeing more of an awakening around sustainability and wanting to wear your values. Like our generations care and want their fashion to mean something more than just cheap. That brands are essentially back to co-opting that interest in sustainability on, well, how can I sell you more stuff, right? Like the H&M Conscious collection, it's like, well, what about the rest of your collection, and how much of it is actual natural materials versus how much of it is just greenwashing. So I think for brands, it's very easy to market environmental sustainability when you have more woke customers that are demanding that. Right? And then when you think about some of the environmental initiatives like saving water in the supply chain or thinking about energy efficiency, that has direct benefits to your bottom line, right? Environmental savings means cost savings. But when it comes to human rights, like outside of the reputational damage, if you're talking about living wages, if you're talking about social protections for workers, that comes at a cost. And so for brands, it is quite strategic to be thinking about environmental sustainability and for getting their customers to pay attention to that rather than human rights. Because, operating with sweatshops and thinking about union busting and mistreatment of workers, I mean, that benefits brands, at least in the short run, which is why we really think of sustainability from an intersectional standpoint. You can't have environmental sustainability without social justice. And, to think about there was a cyclone in Bangladesh recently, the frontline communities in Haiti or Pakistan or Bangladesh are the people who are up against the water shortages, the air pollution, the climate shocks in a way that the Western world is somewhat protected. So if you care about climate justice, you have to care about human rights too.
Yeah, I agree. I hope it's going to change and I hope so. Yeah. And for my last question, I was wondering what's next? What are your long-term goals with the organization, with Remake?
Yeah, so in the very short term, we're going to be very focused on pay up and no new clothes and, really assuring that it's not forgotten, in the 24-hour news cycle, because we know that order volume continues to look very different from how it did last year. We know a lot more brands and retailers will go bankrupt. A lot of factories will shutter. And so there's just going to be a lot of difficulties for workers. And we want to make sure that the world doesn't forget. And so short term, it really is about that urgent relief. But, in the long term, as I said, our big audacious goal is by 2025, can we get 1 million people to commit to our Remake community, to be buying less, to be buying better, to be using their voices to hold the industry transparent and accountable. We're currently working on, what the future of fashion would look like and wanting to put those demands out in the public domain as well. And so, I think for us, we've been really busy because the industry cannot go back to business as usual. If you look at the silver lining from this pandemic, it's to say we have a lesson to learn here. And what we have to do is rebuild the kind of industry that we want, that works for more people than just a few billionaires.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for taking the time and for answering all my questions. It was really interesting, so thank you very much.
It is my pleasure. Thank you for having me. And, I'm so excited to have been a part of this conversation.
Merci à Ayesha d'avoir participé à cet épisode de Nouveau Modèle et merci à Thomas Langlin, notre ingénieur du son. Comme promis en introduction, j'ai une super nouvelle à vous annoncer. Je suis désormais l'une des ambassadrices de Remake en France. Je suis très heureuse de faire partie de cette communauté de personnalités engagées pour une mode plus éthique et plus durable. En tant qu'ambassadrice, je partagerai régulièrement avec vous des informations de Remake et dès que ce sera possible, j'organiserai aussi des événements. Sinon, si vous aimez l'émission, dites-le moi avec des mots doux et des étoiles sur vos applications préférées et parlez-en autour de vous, c'est ce qui m'aide le plus à faire connaître le podcast. Pour ne louper aucun épisode, rejoignez-nous sur Facebook, Twitter et Instagram @nouveaumodèle.podcast. Je vous dis à très bientôt pour rencontrer un nouveau modèle.